Ubisoft's reputation today is a far cry from what it once was in the past. It was once celebrated for its innovation and willingness to take risks. Ubisoft introduced us to a slew of new franchises featuring tight narratives and character-driven, thrilling gaming experiences. Games like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Ghost Recon stand as testaments to Ubisoft's dedication to storytelling and immersive gameplay, captivating us with new gameplay mechanics and engaging plots. However, Ubisoft is now the poster child of AAA greed and laziness, discussed in the same breath as EA and FIFA.
And the biggest proponent behind this criminal level of greed is Ubisoft.
Assassin's Creed. More like Assassin's Greed. Ubisoft's annual cash grab is grabbier than ever.
I want to sue Ubisoft. It's not a joke. I really do want Ubisoft to be taken to court internationally.
What were once iconic and beloved games have now morphed into mere caricatures of the originals, being converted into either live, multiplayer, or RPG games filled to the brim with microtransactions. If you asked most gamers why Ubisoft made such a drastic transformation, an overwhelming majority will tell you Ubisoft is ran and owned by the greedy Guillemot brothers, and they are hell-bent on siphoning every dollar out of our wallets. This notion is so mainstream, it garnered Ubisoft the title of the most hated gaming company in the world in a study performed on Twitter by Rave Reviews, where it ranked first in 23 countries. Yet I believe this mainstream narrative is oversimplified. Like most things in life, the truth behind Ubisoft's descent to infamy is much more complex and nuanced. After a week of digging into their financial reports and listening to earnings calls, I uncovered the 4 reasons why all their AAA games have been turned into bloated live service games with microtransactions, virtual currencies, and pay-to-win elements. When you delve deep into Ubisoft's financial statements, it immediately becomes evident that Ubisoft is desperate and in crisis mode. Its stock price has been on a consistent decline since August 2018. The gravity of their situation was highlighted in January 2023 during an emergency earnings call, where Ubisoft announced the cancellation of 3 unannounced games after Super Mario and Rabbids and Just Dance underperformed. This made it a total of 7 canceled games within just 7 months. It also led to an operational loss of €487 million in 2023, and in an attempt to stabilize and not spook off shareholders, Ubisoft slashed variable costs by €200 million by divesting non-core assets over the next 2 years and announced natural attrition of employees. This is just corporate speak for stopping the support of games they deemed unworthy and laying off several employees. But how is this possible when Ubisoft makes billions in revenue annually? Not to mention the shit ton of money and profits made by some of its titles like Far Cry 5, which grossed over $300 million in its first week of release, and Assassin's Creed Valhalla grossing over $1 billion. To understand why Ubisoft is in its current state, we need to examine their business model, then their financial statements. Ubisoft experiences a considerable delay between incurring production costs and receiving income from game sales. They must first finance game development costs, which are payable after 30 days on average, since they are mostly made up of salaries. They also invest millions in marketing to generate hype and awareness before the game's release, which typically occurs 2 to 3 years later. This means they incur substantial expenses long before seeing any revenue from their games. These intense upfront cash requirements means that the only way to really survive is to have lots of capital and assets to borrow against. Since we now understand their business model, let's unwrap their revenues. Since 2010, Ubisoft has made over €1 billion in revenue and made over €2 billion in 2021 and 2022. To determine their operational profit margins, we have to subtract Ubisoft's 4 main cost centers. Cost of sales, which are generally 30 to 35% of revenues and includes things like server hosting costs and platform fees, paid to PlayStation Store, Xbox Live, Steam, and Epic Games Store. Marketing costs and admin costs, which covers things like legal fees, business travel, and software licenses, and together make up 40 to 45% of revenues. I've saved R&D costs for last since it's Ubisoft's largest cost area, and it uses an accounting trick to make their finances look better than they are. Also, stick with me here because this is the most important part in understanding Ubisoft's desperate attempts to become profitable. Instead of recording all R&D costs, Ubisoft instead capitalizes them and spreads them over 3 years. Here is a clear example of this accounting trickery. In 2022, Ubisoft reported R&D costs of only €822 million. But in reality, they actually spent an extra 831 million euros. Instead of showing this full amount as an expense, they listed it as an intangible asset on their balance sheet, making their expenses look lower and their profits higher. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that Ubisoft's intangible assets in 2022 didn't increase by the full 831 million euros, but only by 429 million euros. That's because Ubisoft amortized or spread out part of these costs from previous years, 2019, 2020, and 2021, into 2022. If Ubisoft had included the entire 831 million euros in their 2022 expenses, it would have wiped out their 350 million euros operational profit and instead record a loss of about 480 million euros. We also have to keep in mind this is not an isolated case, but rather part of Ubisoft's yearly accounting policy. To further prove this, we can examine the growth of Ubisoft's intangible assets over the years on this graph. But this begs the question, how does Ubisoft still finance its operations and still produce AAA games if its profits are just a result of an accounting ruse? Again, the answer lies in Ubisoft's financial statements. This time their cash flow statements, which shed light on its liquidity and ability to finance its operations. Ubisoft has recorded positive cash flows since 2010. This means Ubisoft receives more money annually than it spends, therefore reducing some of its pressures from expenses. Yet, this is still not enough to meet their intense upfront cash requirements. To fund their AAA games, Ubisoft relies heavily on borrowing against its assets. Between 2022 and 2023, Ubisoft financed its AAA games through a series of loans. They renewed a 300 million euros syndicated loan in December 2022 for 5 years, borrowed another 325 million euros with a 3-year term, and issued 3 bonds worth 500 million, 470 million, and 600 million euros, maturing in September 2024, November 2028, and November 2027. Additionally, Ubisoft tapped into a bilateral credit line of 10 million euros and had an outstanding loan balance of 42 million euros set for maturity in 2025. Further adding to their debt burden were loans of 105 million euros maturing in 2025, 50 million euros in September 2026, and 45 million euros in December 2027. Ubisoft is so deep in debt that even if it used all its cash reserves worth 1.5 billion euros to settle all its debts, it would still remain with a debt of 971 million. These debts perfectly expose Ubisoft's failure to innovate or create new franchises. It simply cannot afford to default on any of their debts, which currently amount to 2.2 billion. This is why Ubisoft continues to double down on the Assassin's Creed franchise, which is being their proven cash cow since 2007. Selling over 200 million copies and making it one of the best-selling franchises in gaming history. In their 2023 annual report, Ubisoft announced it would be increasing the number of people working on it by 40% over the coming years. While it's true that expanding the Assassin's Creed franchise could increase player fatigue, the decision is rooted in hard business realities. It's a matter of opportunity cost and mitigating their risk. It would rather drop the 100th Assassin's Creed title than risk creating another franchise that could flop like Skull and Bones. If Ubisoft can't take the risk of introducing new IPs due to their high debts, why does it still continue to pour millions into its AAA titles? Wouldn't it be more prudent for them to cut down on game development costs? With each new Xbox or PlayStation release, there's a leap in graphical processing power. This has sparked an arms race among game studios to enhance graphics fidelity in their AAA titles, even though gamers might be experiencing diminishing returns at this point. Companies like Rockstar, EA, Bethesda, Sony Interactive, Naughty Dog, and Square Enix are leading this charge with franchises like GTA, FIFA, Skyrim, God of War, Uncharted, and Final Fantasy. Ubisoft went a step further and even developed its own game engines for their IPs, Anvil and Snowdrop. Although graphics isn't the only factor gamers consider when buying AAA games, it's undeniably crucial. In 2023, a majority of the best-selling games were AAA titles. In such a competitive landscape, no AAA studio would dare release a game with subpar graphics when top-notch visuals have become the industry standard and expectation. The irony of it all is Ubisoft's push for extremely good graphics is what puts it at the center of the vicious cycle where it has to borrow more money to produce more AAA titles and support their live features. To keep up with the demanding release schedules of franchises like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Just Dance, and Ghost Recon, Ubisoft operates a vast network of 59 studios worldwide. Their workforce has ballooned from 10,667 in 2016 to 20,133 by 2023. To put this into perspective, Netflix, with revenues of $33.7 billion, employs only 13,000 people. This trend is also mirrored in Ubisoft's escalating salary payouts to its developers and designers, which increased from €503 million to €1.1 billion in 2023. At first glance, Ubisoft's huge workforce may appear bloated, but it's actually a reflection of the high number of specialized skills required nowadays to make AAA games, especially on an annual release schedule like Ubisoft's. This includes concept artists who create concept art for characters, the environment and key scenes to establish the visual and feel of the game. Writers are tasked with shaping the game's narrative, including script dialogues and story arcs. 3D artists create detailed models of characters, environments, and objects, while animators breathe life into these creations, ensuring natural and fluid movements. Sound designers craft sound effects, ambient sounds, and voiceovers, while composers create immersive soundtracks. Level designers shape game levels, including layout, enemy placement, and puzzles, ensuring engaging gameplay. Developers write code to implement various game mechanics, AI, and UI elements, while testers playtest the game to identify and rectify bugs, glitches, and performance issues. If Ubisoft cannot compromise on graphics or significantly downsize its employee count, why does it not use the only other lever in its control and increase prices? Although it does not feel like it, when adjusted for inflation, games are cheaper than they were in the 90s and haven't kept pace with inflation. PS4 games that cost $60 in 2013 would be priced at around $80 today. However, Ubisoft's choice not to raise game prices is not about empathy. It's driven by pure business pragmatism. The result? Shifting games to subscription models. Why risk consumer backlash with price hikes when other revenue streams are available? Ubisoft understands our natural sensitivity to price and loss aversion. We don't want to part with money, especially on high-risk purchases. If Ubisoft increased its prices to $140 and removed all microtransactions, its revenues would be capped at the amount of people willing to spend that amount of money on a game. However, by pricing games at $60 to $70, Ubisoft significantly increases the number of people willing to buy their AAA titles and then monetizes them over time with microtransactions. This is the same logic applied to all their free-to-play live games. Free-to-play games massively expands their audience, eliminates all price sensitivity, removes spending ceilings, and drives customer lock-in. Sadly, when it's all said and done, most people will eventually spend more than the $140 over their course of playing the game. Ubisoft's ongoing support for games like Rainbow Siege for 8 years, For Honor for 6 years, and The Division for 4 years underscores the success of this strategy. In fact, their back catalog has consistently contributed more than 50% of their total revenues for 4 consecutive years since 2020. Despite microtransactions, Ubisoft still finds itself on the edge of collapse. But will it implode? To try and predict this, we need to examine the macro trends in the gaming industry. It's no coincidence that major game studios are being devoured by diversified media conglomerates where making games is just one out of their many revenue streams. In 2023, Microsoft finalized its acquisition of Activision Blizzard for $69 billion, securing some of the biggest gaming IPs like Call of Duty and Diablo. They also acquired Bethesda, the makers of Doom and Fallout, for $7.5 billion. Sony, another conglomerate, acquired Bungie Studios, the makers of Destiny, for $3.6 billion, and Insomniac Games for $229 million, giving them first-party rights over Spider-Man and Ratchet and Clank. Obscenely wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia have also not been left out in the current consolidation frenzy of the gaming industry. Saudi's sovereign wealth fund, which owns Scopely, the makers of Monopoly Go, also owns 8.3% of Embracer Group. Embracer went on a shopping spree of gaming studios from 2020 but was forced to sell off Saber Interactive at a loss of $278 million, and Gearbox Studios at a loss of $840 million to Take-Two Interactive after the Saudi sovereign fund failed to fund these acquisitions. Ubisoft looked to China instead. The Guillemot brothers sold a minority stake of their holding company to Tencent, which owns 40% of Epic Games and is currently the largest company in the gaming industry. Through this deal, Ubisoft got an unsecured long-term loan to refinance its debts and for stock buybacks. Although this might seem like a backdoor for Tencent to fully buy out Ubisoft, it's highly unlikely. The Guillemot brothers protected themselves from a hostile takeover by limiting Tencent's ownership of Ubisoft to 10% and restricting any further share purchases for a period of 8 years. They also limited Tencent's stake in their holding company that owns Ubisoft to 29.9%, just below the 30% threshold that would trigger a mandatory takeover. In a context where platforms and business models are converging, this transaction reinforces our ability to create strong value over the coming years. While it's easy to project these same issues to every major game studio like EA, Activision Blizzard, Take-Two Interactive, and Square Enix, I won't do so because every company is run and operated differently, and their financial statements might reveal different realities. For instance, EA and Take-Two Interactive are also active in acquiring game studios without the backing of major conglomerates. Take-Two bought Zynga for $12.7 billion in 2022, and EA bought Glue Mobile for $2.4 billion. Both of these acquisitions were expansions into the mobile game market. I plan to cover how EA and Take-Two Interactive are able to stay independent in future videos, so if interested, subscribe for that. Although the mainstream narrative is game studios are a bunch of greedy Wall Street companies, I think in Ubisoft's case it's a clear example of a business that's desperate due to its flawed business model. Without microtransactions, it wouldn't be able to produce the AAA games that we both love and hate. It just wouldn't be feasible. This is not financial advice, but it also seems clear to me that Ubisoft's entire value is propped up by the IPs it's managed to develop over the years and not strong business fundamentals. Lastly, this video was inspired by Tarmack's video where he makes a different argument to mine and tries to show why games are not too expensive to make. I recommend watching it for a different opinion and make your own judgment call. I've linked it on my description. Thank you.